For more than half a century, the public has always seen Sir Cliff Richard as the polished golden boy, a symbol of decency and endurance in British pop music. In contrast, John Lennon embodied rebellion. A sharp-edged voice willing to shatter every rule in order to lead an entire generation. Two men, two paths that seemed to run side by side, yet in reality were separated by a deep abyss formed by silent wounds that Cliff Richard buried deep within his heart. Behind the gentle smile and calm appearance through countless ups and downs, Cliff Richard carried a disappointment and emotional scar that never truly healed. It was not simply a rivalry over chart positions or record sales between two legendary names. At the age of 83, as the twilight of his career slowly descended, Cliff Richard finally chose to break his silence and reveal the truth. This late confession was not an attack, but a sorrowful sigh about a much deeper pain. The pain of a pioneer being mocked and dismissed by the very younger genius who followed in his footsteps. The truth Cliff revealed shocked fans deeply. It exposed a dark corner in the relationship between legends, where recognition can sometimes mean more than prestigious awards, and where the hurt caused by a fellow artist's words can linger painfully for an entire lifetime. In the late 1950s, before the name The Beatles became known around the world, Cliff Richard was already the face of rock and roll in Britain. With his voluminous hair and energetic stage presence, he was seen as Britain's bold answer to Elvis Presley. Cliff was the trailblazer, the man who proved that youthful music could dominate the British charts. Yet when John Lennon and the Beatles began their rise toward glory, a silent battle over identity quietly erupted. John Lennon, with his sharp personality and desire to destroy every convention, did not choose Cliff Richard as a role model to admire. He chose him as a target to attack. These attacks did not stem from personal hatred, but because in Lennon's eyes, Cliff represented everything, safe, sweet, and comfortably tailored to the middle class, the very things Lennon wanted to tear down and replace with something rawer and more rebellious. Lennon openly used the power of the media to launch cruel mockeries aimed at Cliff's fashion style, his polished songs, and even his loyal fan base. The media attacks of that era created a harsh contrast. On one side stood the outdated and overly polite Cliff Richard, on the other, the Beatles, modern, revolutionary, and overflowing with the spirit of the times. For someone as measured and disciplined as Cliff, being turned into a punching bag for a new cultural movement was not merely a professional challenge, but a devastating blow to the pride of an artist who had devoted himself to laying the first bricks of British pop music. Faced with John Lennon's cruel mockery, Cliff Richard chose a response that many considered noble, but in reality, it was a deeply painful internal struggle. He chose not to fight back with words, but the price of that silence was a lingering pain that lasted for decades. Throughout the years of being attacked by Lennon, Cliff Richard maintained an astonishing level of professionalism. In front of cameras and across newspaper headlines, he always smiled politely and rose above the sensational narratives. Yet behind closed doors, Cliff was genuinely hurt. He could not understand why a fellow artist whom he had never insulted or disrespected would direct such belittling words toward him. What hurt Cliff the most was not the competition over fame, but the complete dismissal of all his efforts. Before the Beatles ever landed their first historic record deal, it was Cliff Richard who had sweated across countless stages to pave the way for youth music in Britain. He fought against the conservatism of the old media establishment so rock and roll could gain acceptance. But when Beatlemania exploded, John Lennon mocked those efforts as though they had been shallow and cheap entertainment. Cliff felt like a frontline soldier whose contributions had been denied by the very people who came after him. For decades, he questioned the reason behind Lennon's hostility. Cliff's silence was not agreement. It was the quiet endurance of an artist who felt erased from the glorious history book that he himself had helped begin. He was pushed into the shadows of doubt, left alone while Lennon's ridicule slowly gnawed away at his confidence for years. When Beatlemania swept across the world, the story of British music began to be rewritten entirely. Suddenly, everything seemed to begin with 4 young men from Liverpool. In that narrative, Cliff Richard's pioneering role became treated like an outdated footnote, a faded prehistoric era people wanted to forget as quickly as possible. Cliff bitterly realized that with just a few careless yet powerful remarks, John Lennon had managed to erase his contributions in the eyes of the media. Lennon once described Cliff's music as shallow and empty, and in a world where John was seen as the saint of authenticity, those words carried the force of a death sentence for Cliff's legacy. It pushed Cliff into a severe crisis of faith in himself. There were nights when he questioned whether Lennon might actually be right. Had he been too safe, too soft? Was his career built more on image than substance? The shifting spotlight did not merely take away his #1 hits, it stole his confidence in the artistic value he had spent years building. Lennon's influence became so overwhelming that critics began viewing Cliff through the lens John had created, an artist of compromise. Cliff Richard was forced to watch his legacy be redefined by the very man he had always respected to some degree. It became an uneven battle over identity, where Cliff's elegance suddenly transformed into a flaw in an era that worshipped rebellion. The incident happened in the early 1970s in a quiet corridor at the BBC studios. Amid the industrial atmosphere and the dim glow of neon lights, two legends unexpectedly crossed paths. There were no cameras, no flashing lights from the press, and no cheering fans. Just two men standing face to face with the reality of themselves. According to Cliff, the atmosphere became so heavy and tense that it was almost suffocating. In that brief moment of confrontation, there was no warm handshake or polite small talk. Cliff later recalled that John Lennon did not avoid eye contact with him at all. Instead, John stared at him with a strange intensity. Cliff felt as though Lennon was studying him carefully through the lens of someone both curious and deeply skeptical. It was if, in that silent moment, John was trying to search for something genuine beneath the safe image he had so often attacked in the press. For Cliff, the encounter created an indescribable feeling. He did not see direct hatred in John's eyes, but rather a deeply reflective observation. Their acknowledgement of each other happened briefly and coldly. The meeting ended without a single word of reconciliation, yet it left a profound mark on Cliff's heart. He realized that no matter what Lennon had said publicly, there still existed an invisible connection between them. The connection of two men standing on the lonely peak of fame. The tragedy in New York in 1980 shocked the entire world, but for Cliff Richard, John Lennon's death carried an even more complicated meaning. It was the moment when a door closed forever, ensuring that the unresolved tensions between them would remain a secret buried within history. When the news of John Lennon's death spread, while the rest of the world poured into the streets to mourn and make emotional public statements, Cliff Richard chose complete silence. That silence was not indifference, but rather the result of a man who had never truly healed from the wounds John had inflicted upon him. He needed time to face the reality that the man who had denied his efforts, his greatest spiritual rival, was now gone forever, leaving no chance for an apology or direct acknowledgement. However, several years later, Cliff made a decision that deeply moved people. He began performing Imagine, Lennon's anthem of peace, during his live concerts. It was an incredibly courageous choice. On stage, Cliff did not deliver long speeches or announce it as a tribute. He simply stood there beneath the dim lights and sang with everything he had. Audiences immediately noticed something different. Cliff did not sing Imagine in his usual polished pop style. He sang it with raw emotion, sometimes sounding fragile and trembling. It was not merely a cover performance. It was an unspoken message sent to John's spirit. Through the melody of Imagine, Cliff seemed to say, "I acknowledge your talent, I acknowledge your vision, even if you once tried to erase my place." It became Cliff's final answer to Lennon, not through bitterness or defensiveness, but through recognition and the highest form of forgiveness an artist could offer. After more than 50 years of hiding those emotional wounds, Cliff Richard at the age of 83 no longer wanted to conceal the truth. He chose to speak out, not to revive old hatred, but to free himself from the shadow of rejection that John Lennon had once cast over him. By telling this story in the twilight of his life, Cliff Richard undertook a journey through the darkness of the past. He understood that to truly find peace, he had to reclaim his own voice. A voice no longer defined by Lennon's mockery. The truth Cliff shared does not diminish John's genius, but it gives us a more human perspective on public idols. They feel pain, they suffer, and they long to be recognized just like anyone else. In recent years, a wave of historical re-evaluation has swept through the music world. Critics and younger generations have begun recognizing Cliff Richard's pioneering role. They now understand that without his groundwork, the path for the Beatles and countless British rock bands afterward would have been far more difficult. Cliff has finally been restored to his rightful place in music history, not as an outdated footnote, but as one of its great foundation builders. Sir Cliff Richard's final choice was forgiveness. Instead of holding on to bitterness, he affirmed that he had always maintained deep respect for John Lennon's talent. He proved that true legacy is not about who wins in the headlines, but about how an artist faces adversity with dignity. Cliff Richard lived long enough to see fame rise and fade, but it was his integrity and his ability to forgive that transformed him into a legend, not only because of his music, but because of the character of a true gentleman. The story of Cliff Richard and John Lennon is a reminder that behind every legend lies the deeply instinctive and vulnerable side of being human. What do you think about Cliff Richard's choice to forgive after carrying those wounds for more than half a century? Perhaps silence and compassion are, in the end, the greatest victory an artist can achieve.